Hey, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this week's edition of Team Tim. Wow, it is December already. My goodness. Let's see. Just less than 18 days or so until Christmas? I don't know if my math's right. I don't know. It's hard. But yeah, hey, we're back here again with Tim and Jesse and our good friend Brian, who's a nerd, compliance nerd, and least trust and power grid, and of course me from Compliance Scorecard. How you guys been?
Doing all right. Still recovering from the holiday, I think. Right? It's this week has been busy. Let's put it that way.
Yeah. Well, Jesse, since you're chatting, come on up, say hello, do your thing.
All right. Hey, welcome everybody. Jesse Miller from Power PSA Consulting and creator of the Power Grid vCISO system. Basically, our mission is to help MSPs crack the code for delivering vCISO services at scale. And we do that through a proprietary framework that helps you create a linked customer journey all the way from messaging to account management.
Wow, it's almost as if you had that practice a couple of times.
Hey.
You threw in a new word now, proprietary program. It's like,
yes.
I'll have to learn a little bit about that down the road. So, Mr. Schnurr, how you been, my friend?
Doing okay. You know, Tim, I'm glad we're back on. We're at our every other week cadence here, so we're continuing to move from topic to topic, but we still have one of our favorite guests, Brian, here. I can't wait to hear his thoughts on vendor due diligence and third-party risk assessments. I'm Tim Schnurr, leasetrust.com, focused in the tri-state, and the tri-state, for any of you guys that don't know that, Connecticut, New Jersey, New York City area. vCISO, also data privacy, setting up data privacy for law firms, financial services, and doctors' offices.
Nice. Thank you so much for that. Brian, you want to come up and say hello?
Sure. Hey, everybody. Thanks for having me back on to talk about vendor due diligence. Looking forward to this chat and this time. Built, grown, sold, exited several MSPs over the years, had some fractional CISO, compliance readiness organizations, professional services, been a full-time CISO for 4 years for a fintech company, and hoping to share some insights on not only how to make compliance suck less, but this vendor due diligence stuff and security questionnaires and the strip search we all have to go through or do or perform. I think this will be a fun conversation. I think a lot of folks out there can relate to having filled out, hundreds of questions to satisfy risk nerds on the other end, so your client or yourself can move a product or a service forward. So I think there should be an engaging, fun one. Thanks.
Oh my gosh, you used my favorite word. Make it suck less. I always get yelled at when I say that. Like, Tim, you're not supposed to say that. And I'm like, well, we actually have a whole video series on we can help make policy suck less. Damn it, stop it. I actually I should make sure I used to own policy.sucks and compliance .sucks. I should make sure those things are still
well,
there.
at least it's more realistic and representative, right? And we're acknowledging that it's not everybody's favorite topic. And this whole easy button concept we see out there in our ecosystem drives me crazy.
You know what I say to the easy button?
Who saw that CMMC in a box this week?
Oh yeah. They're sock in a box, CMMC in a box. We've got boxers like all.
I didn't see that.
You didn't? CMMC in a box? Yeah, don't even get me going. So, but I should probably say hello too, right? Since I'm here and need to do my own thing. Hey everybody, Tim Golden, founder and CEO of Compliance Scorecard, where we help you and your MSP have the risk conversation with your customer. I'm going to hopefully allow you all to lead and run today because this is my, third live stream, I think, today. So, yeah, I'm going to need a little backup here. But, yeah, anyways, excited to talk about, I don't know. Let's just, hold on, let's pull this up real quick. Vendor due diligence.
You had a
vendor due diligence, right? All the things like, back when we had the MSP, I mean, it was only 122 questions long, right?
Let's back up. Let's back up because Brian mentioned third party, right? And I think third party was talking a little bit different, right? Like in terms of, Brian, are you talking about like an investor due diligence or a supplier due diligence? Are you really sticking here with like the vendor, like what's in my stack, like
Yeah, I think
vulnerabilities in my stack?
yeah, a lot of what I thought we would talk about today, and we can take the conversation with that whichever direction makes the most sense. But I was thinking when I think of vendor due diligence, I think of somebody selling something to someone else, and before that customer we're selling to will consume our product or service, there's a questionnaire, or we get asked for our SOC 2 report or ISO certifications, or there's contractual commitments that we have to make around data security and data privacy. So that's usually done during that transaction, where the questionnaire or the request for certifications or log into my portal and answer my 4,000 questions, and then they'll make some sort of risk determination. But Tim, what you shared, I think when I think about vendor due diligence, and as Simon Sinek, right, start with why. So I think it's important to say there's significance, there is relevance to doing vendor due diligence, right? We're all technologically married to one another, and before we get in bed with someone, we'd like to know a little bit about them, right? A little bit about their history, their practices, that kind of thing. So I think the why behind this is really important, right? Is we want to make sure that, hey, if they're going to be in our data flows, if I'm going to hire organization or plug in a platform or consumer service, and they're in my data flows or they're critical to my mission or my business, right? I can't do what I do without this vendor's product or service. I think we want to know a little bit more about them in terms of, do they have a security program in place? Do they have any compliance attestation, certification, authorizations, whatever it is? We need to do a little due diligence there, right? And so I think when we think of the why, it's around kind of the sensitivity to data, the mission, what are they doing for us? How are we consuming their service? Also, regulatory requirements, right? There's a lot of industries that require this sort of assessment and documentation that you've reviewed. Yeah, documentation. Get that, Tim. So there's regulatory requirements to say, hey, we have a process to check our vendors out. And then also, like I said, for business continuity, I need to know if I'm going to consume a product or service from you and you're critical to me to delivering my product or service to my clients. From a business continuity perspective, I need to make sure that you have the right stuff in place, because if you're down, so am I.
Right.
If you're screwed, so am I. So those are the kinds of things that we want to make sure, and then it goes into incident response and some other things. But I have a fun way later, when the time's right today, to talk about how to kind of take some of the brain damage out of vendor due diligence and vendor risk assessments, and put the resources where they matter most by tiering those out. And I have yet another framework to share, but it's a fun one around that.
Is it a proprietary one like Jesse's?
It will be after today. Tim, we'll get hooked up with that IP copyright attorney, and we'll be golden. But love to share a little bit more about that later. But what do you guys think about vendor due diligence? And either you're representing a client, right, Jesse? You do this where you're representing a client, especially as part of a vCISO program. Part of that is you're helping your client perform vendor risk assessments, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, there's so much to unpack here. And I think this is one of the hardest things, or this is what makes this one of those things that nobody really does well, because it's really hard and it has tributaries that stretch out into almost every part of the organization, right? So when I put this up on LinkedIn today, on my page, I said, it's the biggest threat you're not thinking about, right? Yeah. So there's so many things that an errant vendor relationship could cause dramatic downtime in your organization, what you mentioned, Brian. So just at a high level, I think you mentioned this, but talking about tiering and understanding, before we can understand how a vendor is critical to us, we have to understand what our critical systems are and how they interact with those. So I think the first thing you have to do is create a level system of what type of vendor or what category of vendor is this for me. So maybe that's where we start.
It's interesting. I love the concept of categorizing, and I don't know. Now I'm double talking. I do like the concept of categorizing, but I feel like it can get too deep. Right. So maybe making sure that if you are looking at all the things in your business, Canva, I don't know, we use Canva. Do I care about Canva? Is it critical to my business? No. AWS, yeah, critical. StreamYard, maybe somewhere in the middle because we're using StreamYard today. Yeah. So, trying to ensure that not only, an asset inventory list of all the things in our business. Right. Something Maureen and I have been working on recently is making sure we know what those things are. But, Jesse, you mentioned categorization, or Tim, what would you want to be able to categorize things like accounting and finance or in website and software? Like, now we're getting to the whole QuickBooks chart of account stuff.
Yeah, it's like probably criticality, right? And
yeah,
it's a little
impact
bit of,
is how I think about it.
It's a decision tree. I mean, you had a questionnaire of 120 questions. You probably didn't go through that with Canva, right? But AWS, I bet you went through that whole list, right?
Of course I did. Of course I asked them, do you store process data? Do you have classified info? Of course I did not do that with Canva.
Do you have fire extinguishers in your data center?
That's right. Question. Yeah. In case the cloud catches on fire, I'm going to pull out the fire extinguisher.
Right.
Exactly.
So there's got to be some kind of decision trees, and Brian, I don't know if that's in your proprietary,
it is actually,
right? Yeah. Like, in terms of criticality, in terms of data sensitivity, regulatory, right? Like all these kind of things that, you have to comply with that will drive your level of effort in terms of diligence.
Okay. So, okay. Sorry, I have to interrupt and point something out. So this was how forward thinking I was, let's see, in 2016, when I was starting to build out the MSP, and I had this vendor questionnaire. I'm going to pull it up. Look at the question that I have highlighted right here. Number 55, does the company have a secure design lifecycle? Like forward thinking, CISA, right? CISA just put
this stuff did exist in 2016.
I know, but were MSPs asking that? I was like, oh my God.
I don't know if CISA existed in 2016.
But I was asking way back then. I just looking back through this from
forget what year they established themselves.
I digress.
Yeah, but I think.
Well, so here. Oh, go ahead, Brian. Go ahead.
No, go ahead, Jesse, because I think you brought up a great point that I'd love to build on here in a second.
Yeah, let me insert this, and I'll let you go. Is that the way I think about categorization? If I had to put it in a sentence, is business impact. So, what is the effect? How can I enable the business? Like you said, I don't want to stop marketing from using Canva while I go through a month of security back and forth for a DDQ, right? I want to say, how critical is this to the business? If it's a low criticality or a transactional type of service, we're going to just monitor and go on and use it, right? So that allowing the business to move faster is how I want to think about ranking. And so take it from there, Brian.
Yeah, for sure. And that's exactly what I wanted to kind of put an exclamation point on, Jesse. And we started off talking a little bit about why, but the what and the where is where you start to say, okay, these are, I'm working with my client, and these are the client's critical business functions that drive revenue, right? And within those critical business functions, there's people, process, technology, right? Humans doing things with tools. And when I think about that, I think of, okay, there's systems and functions. There's a CRM function, there's a sales function, there's a accounting function, right? Those kinds of things. And they use applications, they use vendors, they use all kinds of things, right? In terms of either servers and other infrastructure or cloud services or other things that drive those things, right? So when I think about vendors, and this is where my super proprietary framework comes in here, and this is where I need the MSPs, and I think, this is where we'll probably get some, where I can hear the eyes rolling in the audience, but it's MSPs. we use that, and we saw Tim do it a little bit here too. Engineer side of our brain comes out. We want to over engineer this and overthink it and make it way harder than it has to be. Okay.
I don't do
So,
that enough.
well, I know in MSPs it's analysis paralysis, and it's like, okay, I'm going to do this, and oh my gosh, I'm going to have 12 different tiers or buckets, and based off this is the kind of script search they get. And if you've never done vendor risk assessments, lean in here for a second on my very proprietary and highly sensitive, soon to be copyrighted framework called Here's what it's called. I don't have a good name for it. I'll just call it Kids, Pets, and Plants. Okay. So when you think about a babysitter, and you're going to have a babysitter for your kids, or someone to watch your dog, or someone to water your plants. Okay. That's how I kind of want to approach and talk about kids, pets, and plants. So if we think about kids, I think of that as our critical vendors, right? Do we all have kids on the panel here? Jesse,
Yeah.
I know you do. Tim?
Yeah.
Yep, Tim. Yeah, so when we think about if we're going to hire a babysitter to babysit our kids, would that require a higher level of scrutiny and assessment versus someone that we might dog sit or watch our cat come in and feed our cat?
We got a turtle.
Yeah.
I was gonna say, I don't know. I feel like we take our dogs very seriously and we vet them, as you can tell. So maybe for us, we're the exception to that rule. But I think I hear where you're going, Brian.
Yeah. So I think of tier one of our critical vendors, right? We can't operate if that vendor is down or that vendor is so intertwined with our data flows that if they get poisoned, we get poisoned too. Or it impacts our ability to deliver and service our clients, right? They're so critical to our business. And let me stop here because I've gotten criticized in the past, and I want to mitigate that here. Is when I say business or driving revenue, it could also be, if it's a nonprofit, their mission, right? I would still argue that a lot of nonprofits do a lot of fundraising, and a lot of money is important, right? But it's really the vision or the mission, right? So tier one, kids. And with a tier one kids type of vendor, I'm going to put together a program, and I'm going to spend most of my time on my vendor risk assessments right there. They're going to get a higher level of scrutiny. Not only am I going to want to send them a questionnaire, and I'll get to the questionnaire in a second, but not only am I going to send them a questionnaire, I'm going to have it be open-ended questions. Tell me about your security program. Tell me why I should trust you. My brown M&M, my favorite question to ask on a questionnaire is for them to rate their security on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being awesome, world-class, 0 being non-existent. That question alone, I ask them to rate it, and then I ask them to tell me why they rated it that way. Mm-hmm. You can tell so much about the maturity of a vendor based on that response, right? I've seen them rate themselves as a 10, world-class security, right? But yet other questions, they don't have any policies, they don't have a program, they don't have anybody designated being responsible, they have no business continuity plan. And so that to me is an area where you zero in on the questionnaire. But you also put in contractual contingencies around compliance, around breach, notification, those kinds of things you build in. But you want to spend most of your time on the babysitter for the kids. Okay. So that's where I say, hey, we want to focus on the kids, spend our time there because the stakes are higher. Right. So they're going to get the full security questionnaire. We're going to ask for audit reports. We're probably going to ask a little bit more about their incident response plans. Again, tie them to contractual obligations and MSAs, DPAs, and the like, and then monitor them pretty closely. Okay. Pets, tier 2, right? we love our pets, Tim, right? Some of us are dog people, some of us are cat people, whatever that is. But at the same time, I'd like to think that I'm going to take my babysitter through a little bit more scrutiny if they're going to spend some time with watching my kids and taking care of my children versus my pets. Okay. So with the pets, there might be, that's supporting more non-critical functions, right? If that vendor had a problem, they're not in our data flows. Yeah, it would be annoying. It would cause a bit of a problem, but we would still be able to function, right? And then the last tier that you don't spend a lot of time on is the one watering your plants. My wife might disagree because she loves her plant,
Brian,
but at the same time,
I'd even say watering your lawn because it's outside your house.
True,
right?
True.
Plants is like you're still getting in there.
Yeah, the physical security aspects of it, of people that are in your house. And where we see that oftentimes is where people say, oh, they're just the janitorial service. They just come in here at nights and weekends, walk wherever they want, and have access to file cabinets and unattended access everywhere, right? That to me is where you would really question. And this is the most important thing that people mess up when it comes to vendor risk assessments. Okay, two things. When you evaluate a vendor, you need to evaluate the use case. How is my organization using, think of Microsoft. Oh, I vetted Microsoft, they're good. Really? On what multitude or accordion of products did what's your use case? How are you consuming that product or service? Who's using it? And what part of the business is it being used or consumed? That's the biggest area is the risk nerds will evaluate and say, oh yeah, Microsoft, they're good to go. Right?
Really?
Are they? Right? Well, I'm making that up, but I mean, most people, oh yeah, we looked at their SOC 2 report and we put them through our vendor risk assessment. We closed that ticket. Whatever you want to consume from Microsoft is good. And so there's two things that get screwed up there. The person doing the risk assessment doesn't understand the use case and how it's consumed, because sometimes we'll do a vendor risk assessment on an organization, a vendor, and they might not be up to par or up where we need them to be in terms of a risk profile, but we can put in compensating controls. We can say, all right, vendor, we'll let you work with us, but you don't have these things in place. We're going to put a contractual contingency that you have to be SOC 2 Type 2 within 12 months. At the same time, you're going to go under our access controls, right? We're going to do things to shrink our risk so we're not as technologically married or connected. Okay. The other thing is use cases change. So people do not have, a lot of organizations for their vendor due diligence don't build in change management along with that, right? Because a vendor's risk profile can change, and also what we're consuming and how we're consuming it changes. So those triggers have to be built in. But if we think about this, don't overthink it. If we can think of kids, pets, plants, and look at it from that, hey, I'm hiring a babysitter to either watch my kids, take care of my pet, or water my plants, and start tiering them out that way. And that's just another way, I think, to think about it without getting caught up in our underwear over SCRM and what is it, Tim, NIST 161 or whatever that is on supply chain risk management. Without getting all caught up in those, if we kind of start there and understand the pragmatic concerns, we start to build a more meaningful, I think, thoughtful
so
vendor due diligence.
What I think I heard you say is when Compliant Scorecard decides to build out something around vendor due diligence, we need to call it kids, pets, and plants. It is such a huge challenge, right? You know what? I'm going to let Jesse or Tim chime in because I could talk for hours.
I was going to pull some stats. I mean, before we even jumped into kind of why this is important, right? I mean, think about, everyone knows, I think everyone on the call here knows like Robert Chiaffi, right? Like you say, what is it, July 20, clearly a kid, right? Clearly critical to the business, lost a significant amount of clients, right? Like, so the risk is real. I mean, CrowdStrike, Delta Airlines, right? I mean, what you can kind of go down the list. I think you're digging into something, Brian. And I think it's great that you're triaging, as you said, in terms of criticality. There's probably another element of that as well, right? Like in terms of how much exposure do they have, right? I mean, it could be a critical vendor. Maybe it has a lot of exposure. So if it's on every endpoint, or is it something like, AWS server based, right? Tim, I don't know how your stack is set up, but
Okay.
Go ahead, Jesse.
Well, yeah, well, I mean, I think there's all the stuff there I agree with. There's not much to say about it, but I think some practical outworkings, I know, for example, in some of the programs I've done in the past, is writing a quick business use case for what's approved. You talk about that change management. Yeah, and I think the stoplight, the kids, pets, plants kind of rating is a good way to go to get started. And you could fit them into any one of those. Once they fit into one of those buckets, so to speak, you run your process on them. But you might have someone who's rated as a critical vendor. They don't meet requirements. And so you say, okay, we're going to bump them down to a medium vendor, which means they don't get access to XYZ, but we still have this particular business use case. Now, if our team wants to use them for these other things, they've got to do the change management and resubmit the request. So you got to build those processes. And I think that's important, right? The other piece is then it's not just how they enable our business, it's particular threats that their access could pose to our business. So I think we just talked about the positive side. What did we use them for to enable our business? And then the negative side, what risk do they pose to our business? So I just saw, I think it was today, but it happened like 2 days ago. There was this Clearway Pain Solutions got a $1.19 million fine because they had a contractor that they forgot to shut access off for, who then accessed 34,000 records and submitted 6,500 fraudulent claims using that data. And then when they went in and did the OCR audit, they had no program in place of any kind. And this is not a big business. I think there were like 200 and some employees on LinkedIn, right? Nationwide. So this is not a big business. They just got hit with a 7-figure fine because they didn't have appropriate vendor controls in place to lock out access and to do that change management and shut vendor access off when they're done. So why am I saying all that? It's like the segue into, once we've approved or gone through our due diligence with the vendor, there's that vendor management piece, right? So ongoing, how do we protect ourselves from vendors? So that's where I'd maybe like to get thoughts from people next.
Yeah, for me, that's always been a matter of focus, right? Especially the ongoing component to it. If I simplify this even more, if I think of 3 tiers, tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, I think of tier 1, I always relate it back to the data flows. So tier 1, critical to our mission, they're in our data flows, right? Tier 2, they're in our data flows, but they're not critical to our mission. Tier 3, they're neither in our data flows and they're not critical. So that's kind of where I start. And if they're a tier 1, this is where I don't want to get into proper nouns and names of tools, but there's some decent ones out there, especially if you do a 3-tier system where you can, not only do you set them, you do the initial risk assessment work, but the ongoing monitoring component, you can monitor them just like a credit score, right? And what I like about some of the vendor risk assessment platforms out there, there's a couple that are pretty good, where you can monitor that vendor, again, just like you would a credit score, which is behavior based, which I love, right? So you say, so I could say I have tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. Think about a credit score, right? So tier 1, I have to have you at 700 or higher. Think of that just like your credit score. Tier 1 is 700 or higher, and I'm going to monitor that. That's all in PCI and other frameworks here. So I say, okay, if I'm going to monitor this vendor's behavior over a period of time, if it goes below 700, I'm going to dig in. That's going to send me an alert. I'm going to get in and I'm going to figure out why, and I'm going to have a conversation with them.
Yeah.
Right. And so that's a great way to, and the behavior-based monitoring on that too. What I love about it, it's just like your credit score on some of these too. Just because, for example, if I miss a payment, let's say I have a payment and I miss it, and it gets reported to a credit bureau, just because I pay it the next month on time doesn't mean that goes away, right? It impacts my score. It dings me. and my score goes down for a little period of time and until I've earned back kind of that number, right? It's not that immediate gratification where I can go in and I say, oh, I paid you on time. And then they, oh, okay, everything's fine. We trust you forever and always. And now your score automatically goes back up. So Jesse, what I like to do after, if I can kind of have those 3 tiers, just like we talked about, kids, pets, plants, tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, I can start assigning numbers to those. And then if I'm monitoring and they go below a threshold, then I can get in touch with them. And I'll tell you where the rub often is, though. You can come up with a great 3-tier system, right?
Yep.
I've been in this as CISO before. And Jesse, you probably know what I'm talking about. As CISO, where it's like, hey, we have a mature vendor risk management program put in place, right? It's well documented. We have scoring, we have the whole thing, we know how to do it. And sometimes the business comes back and says, no, we're using this vendor. No, we're using this product. Right. So guys, I'll pose that. You can be the greatest risk nerd and most comprehensive risk assessment on your vendors that you want. But sometimes the business says, no, we're using them. What's been your guys' experience with pushback from either a client or from, if you're a CISO performing vCISO services where the business says, yeah, we're moving forward with them. They're the only provider that can do this, or they're the only ones that can do it right away, or they've got the best price, or whatever that is. Sometimes the business pushes back.
Yeah, compensating controls, right? Like, I mean, if you're lucky, I mean, if you've got a veto, great. It's, as you said, if it's a unique vendor, they're going to go with the vendor. But what can you put in? Definitely pound the table on the risk, right, Brian, that you're pointing out. But there's going to have to be compensating controls. So.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I have some personal experience with this, and there specifically something comes to mind that I know this is a pretty major issue is, and not unique to this industry, but in pharmaceuticals, because you have years of development cycles with a manufacturer to vendor, and they're the only game in town. Like, you have 2 or 3 years of sharing trade secrets and test data and trial data and manufacturing data, and you just simply can't go away from them. And we know in the healthcare industry that not everybody has the best security. So what do you do in that case? Well, I would argue that you just got into the supply chain defense business. So for those who aren't familiar with that acronym, we're starting to see it more, that term. You're really going to start to run a security program for your vendors as best you can. So you can talk about, is that fair? Should we have to do that? No, we shouldn't, but we're trying to make the organization secure. And so I think, Brian mentioned some of these monitoring tools. Those are really good for, running third-party attack surface management stuff, being able to spot issues. Like if they have a 0-day vulnerability pop up, you get a focus tag pop up and tell you, hey, there's an exposed XYZ vulnerability that's got an EPSS score of 90. Like, this needs to be fixed now. So you got to call them and be like, hey, you have this going on. You need to get this fixed. Or we're going to shut off connections right now until it's fixed. Okay. And do those mitigating factors. Likewise, if you're monitoring, for breach and doing threat intelligence, if they experience a breach, then you're proactively shutting off access to systems and doing things like that. So you're basically trying to help them improve. And for those tier 1 critical vendors where they're required, they're in the supply chain, they're in the manufacturing process, there's nothing we can really do. So we're just going to have to try and use our expertise to help them kind of bring them along with us on the journey. And so that's how I see it from like a pragmatic perspective, is how you have to handle it, right? And you have to document that the risk is there, and there's not much more you can do past that.
Yeah, Jesse, I was going to ask that question in terms of like ongoing due diligence and monitoring, which Brian talked about. I think it's a tough ask. You don't always have access to them. Like that initial access, I think you get a much deeper view, right? Like, what are you doing for MFA? What's your culture? Like, all those questions are so it has the ongoing stuff's a little more non-invasive, right? It signals what kind of telemetry you got out there. You mentioned EPSS, so you're scanning. If you have access to the code or source code, great. you can kind of see their software bill of materials. But from an ongoing perspective, Brian, is there anything like, how are you doing that, right? Like, insurers don't do a very good job with this, right? Like, they ask a questionnaire and it's a check the box activity, and then a year later they kind of go through it again, right? So
yeah, when the business really pushes back and wants to use a specific vendor, depending upon the criticality, that's the level of pushback that I do. And generally speaking, back in, I remember I was CISO at a fintech company, and had this situation, right, where a critical vendor, they were nichey. The business wanted to use them. It was it solved a business problem, right? And so the best thing I could do is work with the legal team and put in contractual contingencies around, hey, within 12 months, you're going to get ISO certified. Because you know what? That vendor wants to continue to sell to us, right? We're a bigger fish. We have leverage. And when you have leverage, that's generally when you can ask for things in the contract. And you say, hey, we love you. We want to use you, but you don't have any program in place. You can't prove any of these things are in place. So we're going to have, Tim, you mentioned some compensating controls. What are those? We're going to handle all the access control. We're going to define this hard boundary. We're going to get MOUs in place. We're going to do a number of things. But the number one thing I can do is start imposing the fact that they need to get a formal program in place. By doing that, I say, hey, you have a year contingency to be ISO 27001. And also, while you're doing that, is we want to see your quarterly vulnerability scans. We also want penetration test results with it. Again, you have leverage. You put these things in the contract, and then you check in on them. Hey, the contract's been going pretty good. This is my 1 or 2 month check-in. How's it going with your I want to see your engagement letter with the audit firm. I want to make sure that these things that you promised that you would do are real, right? So contractual contingencies, if you have a business says yes and you're saying whoa, then that's usually the best avenue to go in, is start imposing, getting them up to a standard over a period of time and working with them. And I think I heard it earlier, where we're actually helping the vendor improve. And I think we're going to see so much of this with CMMC.
I was just about to say that.
CMMC is these little manufacturers and all this, they provide niche things, right? We're working with a couple now where it's like they provide they're one of the only people on the planet, this little manufacturing firm that supplies these little connectors that a DoD contractor, right? These little connectors. And so now what the big company is saying is,